In the spring of 2013, in Jasper County, Iowa, a 15-year-old girl named Della Rourkes walked out to the flattest, blackest 60 acres her family owned. Ground that had grown champion corn for 4 generations, knelt down in the dirt, and started planting what every man who drove past County Road F62 took for weeds, not corn, not beans, weeds. She had a 5-gallon bucket of seed that looked like floor sweepings, grey, chaffy, full of bristles, and she walked it in long ribbons across the best dirt in the township, scattering it into ground that was supposed to be worth 200 bushels an acre. Cal Pfeffer farmed the quarter section to the east. He slowed his truck to a crawl the first morning he saw her out there, watched a while, then he laughed, the way a man laughs when he doesn't know what else to do, and drove straight to the co-op to tell it. By noon, half of Prairie City had heard the Rourke girl was planting ditch grass through prime tillable ground. By supper, they'd done the math on what that dirt rented for and decided the family had finally lost its mind. She didn't explain herself. That was her way. She just kept walking those rows, bucket on her hip, seed hissing into the soil. They thought she was throwing away the farm. They were wrong. And in a little over 2 years, a good number of them were going to be standing in the middle of that field with their hats in their hands, trying to understand how a teenager had seen the one thing every grown man in the county had driven past his whole life. But I'm getting ahead of it. Let me back up. If stories about patience and stubborn young people and the quiet wisdom that skips a generation means something to you, take a second and subscribe. Join our farming family here and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We like knowing who's out there listening. Now, the Rourkes. They'd been on that ground since 1897. When Della's great-great-grandfather broke the first furrow with a walking plow and a pair of mules he'd bought on credit he had no business having. 260 acres, tucked into a slow bend of the South Skunk River, a few miles from where the tall grass still grows wild at the Neil Smith Refuge. Corn and beans, mostly. A dozen head of cattle. A red barn that leaned a little more every winter and somehow never fell. Della was the youngest of 3, and the only one who wanted the place. Her brothers had gone off to Des Moines and Cedar Rapids, to jobs with air conditioning and a roof that didn't leak. She stayed. She was a quiet girl, watched more than she spoke. She'd sit on the tailgate at the edge of a field for an hour just looking at it, and her father used to say she was the only person he knew who could hold still long enough to see something change. She wasn't perfect. Stubborn to the point of foolishness, forgot her chores when a thing caught her interest, had a temper she kept on a short chain, but had. She once didn't speak to her brother for a solid month over a dog, but she noticed things, and here's what she'd started noticing by the time she was 13. Every hard rain took a little more of the farm down the hill and into the river. The water ran off the fields brown as coffee. In the spring, you could stand on the bank and watch the topsoil go. 4 generations of it, sliding into the Skunk on its way to the Mississippi and the Gulf. Nobody else seemed bothered. It had always done that. That was just rain, but it kept eating at her. Why does the water leave brown? Where's it taking all that black dirt? And why does nobody around here seem to care that the farm is quietly washing away under their boots? She didn't have the answer yet. She got it from an old man in an old box, Emmett Rourke. Her grandfather, 80 years old, hands like tree roots. A man who'd farmed through the 50s and 60s and watched the county rip out every fence row and grass. Waterway it had for the sake of a few more rows of corn. Emmett kept a wooden cigar box on the shelf above his bed, and in it, among other things, was a brittle, foxed pamphlet from the United States Soil Conservation Service, printed in 1938, back when the whole middle of the country was blowing away in the Dust Bowl, and the government was begging farmers to hold their dirt down before it was all gone. His own father had saved it. The paper had gone soft as cloth. Emmett read it to her one winter afternoon. He tapped a diagram of prairie grass with one thick finger. Roots, he said. That's all it ever was. We had it, we tore it out, and nobody's ever bothered to put it back. He told her about the prairie that stood there before the plow Grass so tall a man on horseback would disappear into it. Roots that reached down farther than any of them had ever dug. That was the spark. An old man, an old box, and a girl who actually listened. Then she went and did what she always did. She read the rest herself. And she found out that old pamphlet had grown up into something with hard numbers behind it. Now here's the part they were all laughing at. And here's exactly why they never should have. Corn is a shallow thing. In a good year, its roots reach down maybe 4 or 5 feet, and then they die every single fall. Native prairie is another animal entirely. Big blue stem drives roots down 7 feet. Switchgrass 10. And the compass plant, that tall yellow bloom that turns its leaves north and south to duck the noon sun, sends a taproot 15 feet into the earth and keeps it there for 100 years. Stay with me, because this is the whole thing. This is what Della saw, and nobody else did. Those roots do 2 jobs. When the old ones rot, they leave channels behind, thousands of them, like a sponge packed full of straws. Rain that used to sheet right off the surface soaks straight down instead. And up top, the stems stand stiff and thick at the base, so when a hard rain comes, they act like 1,000 little dams and force the water to slow down. And slow water drops its dirt. It sets the topsoil back down on the field, gently, instead of dragging it to the river. Here's the number that stopped her cold. Researchers at Iowa State University had been testing this exact idea right there in Jasper County. They found that if you turn just 1/10 of a crop field into strips of native prairie, planted along the contour and across the low spots where the water gathers, you cut the soil washing off that field by 95%. 90% of the phosphorus held. 85% of the nitrogen held 1/10 of the land. Doing almost all of the protecting. Della read that twice. 95%. From weeds. She didn't run and tell the neighbors. She told her grandfather, and she told her father at the kitchen table on a long, quiet winter night. Her father wasn't a fool. He'd watched that slope bleed every spring of his life and never had a name for the cure. So he did the math a different way than the co-op did. 60 acres on that hillside were losing money and losing dirt every year anyway. If the girl was right, the strips would save the rest. You really believe this, he said. I do, she said. Then it's your project. Your seed money. Your browse. He'd let her run the steer money she'd been saving since she was 9. $3,100, every dollar she'd earned in 4-H. If she was going to bet on it, she was going to bet her own. Deal, she said. That was the whole conversation. Now, it did not go easy. Things worth doing almost never do. And this is the part most folks would have quit at. The first planting, spring of 2013, mostly failed. Native prairie doesn't come up like corn. That first year it pours everything into roots you can't even see, and up top it looks like bare dirt, foxtail, and a few sad little sprigs. By July, her strips were a mess of the very weeds everyone had accused her of planting. And Cal Pfeffer's laugh went around the county a second time. Strike one. Then the rains came late that summer and gullied out her longest strip before it had rooted, washed the seed down into a useless pile at the bottom of the slope. She got down on her knees in the mud and reseeded it by hand. Strike two. Then the cattle found a gap in the fence that fall, and grazed a full acre of new growth down to bare ground before her father spotted them and ran them off. Strike 3. Times in a year and a half. That field looked her in the eye and said no. She fixed the fence. She reseeded the gully. And she waited out the ugly stage that every prairie has to pass through. Those 2 long years of looking exactly like failure, while the real work happens underground, where nobody can see it. She didn't complain where anyone could hear her. She just kept walking out there at dusk to look at it, holding still, long enough to see it change, and in the second summer, it changed. The blue stem came up chest high and turned blue-green, then bronze. Gunflowers and black-eyed Susans lit the strips up yellow and purple. Meadowlarks nested in it, and when the wind moved across those ribbons of grass, the whole field seemed to breathe. It was pretty. Everyone agreed on that much. Pretty doesn't pay the taxes, they said. Then came June of 2015, and everything the county thought it knew was about to change in a single night. The animals knew first. They always do. Emmett's old barn cats wouldn't come down from the loft. The cattle bunched up tight in the far corner of the pasture and wouldn't graze. And Roy Tilden, 81 years old, a retired cabinet maker who'd lived in that county his whole life and could read weather better than any radio, stood out on his porch that evening and watched the western sky turn the color of old brass. "Not tonight," he told his wife, "but it's coming. And when it comes, it'll come all at once." It came 2 nights later. 6.8 inches of rain between midnight and 4 in the morning. The kind of storm that used to come once a generation and now seemed to show up every few years. The skunk jumped its banks. Every field in the township ran. Morning came grey and dripping. Della's father drove the gravel roads slow, the way you do after a storm. And what he saw, he never forgot. Cal Pfeffer's cornfield was cut with gullies you could lose a calf in. Half his hillside was just gone, down to the river. The black topsoil piled brown against the road ditch, corn stalks laid flat and half buried in mud. Field after field, the same story. The whole county had bled out overnight, worse than ever, and then he came to Della's 60 acres. He stopped the truck in the middle of the road. The corn between the prairie strips stood up straight and clean. The water had come down that slope just as hard as it hit anywhere else. But it slammed into those ribbons of deep-rooted grass and slowed and spread and sank into the ground and set its dirt right back down where it belonged. The gullies stopped dead at the grass. There wasn't a spoonful of topsoil in her ditch. And the meadowlarks were already back out there, singing on the bent-over blue stem like nothing in the world had happened. One field held. In the whole valley, one. Because a 15-year-old girl had spent 2 years getting laughed at and didn't quit. Cal Pfeffer came the next afternoon. Drove up the lane, got out. Walked the edge of that field a long, long time without a word. Della came out and stood beside him. He was 62 years old and had farmed that ground longer than she'd been alive. He looked at his own ruined hillside across the road. Then at hers. "I was wrong," he said, "that was all. Nobody made a speech about it." He put his hat back on and drove home. The next spring Cal put in strips of his own. Didn't announce it. Just called Della one evening and asked what the seed man's number was. She gave it to him. That was that. Then the van place did it. Then the young couple who'd bought the old Dietrich farm. Marlene Voss, the county extension agent, 51 and sharp as a tack, started getting calls she'd been trying to make for 10 years. Only now they were coming to her. Nobody held a meeting. No program, no pledge, no ribbon to cut. It just spread the way useful things do. One fence line to the next. One hard rain teaching what no pamphlet ever could. Within 4 years, you could stand on the bridge over the skunk and see it plain. Ribbons of tall grass running through the corn, all up and down the valley. The same grass that stood there before any Rourke ever broke a furrow. Put back a tenth at a time by people who'd finally stopped laughing. There's a line from Aldo Leopold, who understood this ground as well as any man ever has. "We abuse land," he wrote, "because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." Della never quoted it to anybody, probably never even read it. But she'd lived it out there with a 5-gallon bucket at 15 years old, which is the only way anyone ever really learns a thing. And here's the truth of it. The corn she saved that June, the topsoil she held on that hill, that was never really the harvest. The real harvest was slower and quieter than that. It was a whole county learning to slow down and finally listen to what the water had been trying to tell them for 100 years. It was an old man's cigar box, turning out to be worth more than the ground it sat over. It was patience, and paying attention to the one thing everybody else drives right past. She held still long enough to see it. That was enough. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been laughed at for doing the slow, patient thing, the right thing, while everyone around you was dead certain you'd lost your mind? And did they ever come back around quiet and stand in your field? Tell us about it down in the comments. And tell us where you're watching from tonight, too. We read every single one. And if you want more true-to-life stories about the quiet ones who turned out to be right all along, subscribe and stay with us. There's another one coming next week.